So welcome to the Global Scholars Symposium in Cambridge. My name is Bostrom. I'm a professor at Oxford University, where I direct the Future of Humanity Institute. It's a multidisciplinary research organization, and our mission is to try to apply careful thinking to the really big picture questions for humanity, the ones that are often ignored by academia. So we study things like, are there threats to the very survival of intelligent life? Is there some way that with advancing technologies that we might one day change the human nature in some fundamental way through biomedical enhancement technologies? And how is it possible to know anything about these questions in the first place? Can we do better than just express our prejudices or make stuff up? And what I want to take this occasion to talk to you about is just introducing one concept that might be useful for those of you who are actually thinking about what you might do in your life to achieve the maximum amount of good, or the maximum amount of expected good, if you multiply the magnitude of the impact with the probability of actually achieving it. I think there is a simplifying concept that helps make sense of the enormous task of trying to prioritize among all the possible things that one can do. Fighting for political justice, or working on alleviating world poverty, or combating diseases. There are so many important causes, but there is no reason to think that these causes are roughly equally important. It's quite plausible that there are orders of magnitude difference in how much good you can do in different areas. But what I would suggest is that there is this simplifying rule of thumb that can help narrow down the range of plausible ways of improving the world. And that's the concept of an existential risk. So an existential risk is simply a threat that endangers the entire future of humanity. So it's an extinction risk, a threat to the survival of the human species, or any other way in which we could permanently and drastically destroy our future. So if we were to go extinct, that obviously would destroy all the future, but if you could imagine some scenario where we permanently lock ourselves into some radically suboptimal scenario, a global totalitarian regime with fancy surveillance system that you can never overthrow it, like something like that might also count as an existential catastrophe. Now, we don't know exactly what the probability is that humanity will succumb to an existential catastrophe. There have been various books written about this and some opinion polls taken among experts, and the results vary slightly. A typical result might be the one we got here a couple of years ago when we had a conference bringing together some experts in different risk areas from across the field, and at the end of that conference we had an informal poll, and the median answer to the question of how likely is it that humanity will be extinct by the end of the century was just under 20% among that group, which is a fairly typical result among those who have thought about it. Now, maybe the best answer is less than that. Maybe it's just 5%, or maybe it's higher, maybe it's 50%. The argument doesn't really sensitively depend on how big the probability is. Where we get a clear result is when we consider the values that are on the line here. So think about this. So right now we have on this planet maybe 7 billion people. Now, if we assume that a human life from a fundamental moral point of view is equally valuable whenever it occurs in time, that it doesn't fundamentally matter whether a certain episode of suffering or whether a happy life occurs now or in 100 years or in 1,000 years, then you quickly realize that the amount of value that could be realized in the future is vastly greater than the amount of value that can be realized in the present. Earth might remain habitable for another billion years, if we make it through the next few critical centuries, and there could therefore be more than 1 million generations in the future just on our planet, maybe of roughly equal size to the present generation. So already there, if we just consider the potential on this one planet, there is 1 million times more on the line for the future than there is at the present. So that suggests that if you could reduce existential risk by even just 1 millionth, then that might be worth something in expected value terms similar to saving all of the people currently alive. the values are just enormous. Now this is of course a radical underestimate, because if we survive the next few centuries, if we eventually go on to develop mature technology, then it's quite possible for our descendants eventually to start to colonize the universe, and there is a lot more out there than there is down here. There is maybe 100 billion stars just in our galaxy, and there is like 100 billion galaxies out there that we could eventually reach. So if you take into account the full potential, you have to multiply this factor of 1 million that we already got just from considering Earth by another factor of maybe 10 to the power of 22 or so, which is a mind-boggling number. You could get an even further factor if you take into account that there might be ways of sustaining lives or consciousness in the future that would be more efficient than biological bodies. But let's set that aside. Even just these three numbers, 1 million times 10 to the power of 22, is such an astronomical number that the end result is that if you multiply this ginormous astronomical number, the potential value that could exist in the future, with even the tiniest probability of actually making a difference to whether this enormous value eventually comes to exist, you will get the kind of expected utility that will just tend to trump everything else that you can do. So if you could reduce the total level of existential risk by dedicating your life to working on this by, say, 1/1000th of a percentage point, on this line of reckoning, that would be worth vastly more than curing AIDS or eliminating world hunger. Now, there are various assumptions here that one could question. One could question the idea whether the total value of the world is really obtained by just summing over the values of the lives that exist in the world, and moral philosophers have a different view there. Nevertheless, I think it does put things in perspective, that arguably the problem of deciding what the best thing for you to do simplifies to what we might call the max-epoch rule, which is maximize the probability of an okay outcome, where an okay outcome is any that avoids existential catastrophe. And anything you can do to reduce existential risk in practical terms will just be far more valuable than anything else you can do. So that might help as a kind of prioritization device, particularly if we consider here that the current generation is at a very special place in history. We're just on the threshold to developing transformative technologies later in this century. We might have synthetic biology, advanced molecular nanotechnology. We might build machines that match and surpass humans. We don't know how long these things will take, but maybe they will happen in this century, maybe in the next century. But we're somewhere near this kind of bottleneck, I believe, such that if we do make it through, if there are still humans thriving in a civilization 500 years from now, it probably means we have overcome the greatest existential risks. But that the next several decades or the next century or so will be critical, and that therefore this is the nut cutting time. This is the time to kind of focus in on making sure that we protect the most essential thing, which is our survival and our potential for desirable future development. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, what should you do? The first thing I think is to learn more about it, and there is a growing number of community of people, particularly in the effective altruism community, that is thinking hard about this question of prioritization and about which career you should choose if you actually want to do the most good in the world, which charities you should donate to, and so forth. And so it's worth tapping into this existing body of thinking that has been developing over the past few years. And if you are still interested after that, then you might want to get in touch with one of these groups or organizations that is active in this field. And if you're not very moved by this appeal, then maybe you either need to acknowledge to yourself that you're not actually interested in doing the best thing for the world, that you have more selfish motivations, or come up with some other justification or excuse, maybe a different moral philosophy that doesn't recognize the suffering and happiness of future people as equal to the present. But either way, I hope that these remarks might make you pause and think, at least for a little while. Thank you.